But it was the coverage of the Vietnam War and the anti-war demonstrations here that was an almost continuous backdrop. And Madison news crews were grizzled veterans of covering those protests.
We got to know the UW very well. All the shortcuts and hiding places you could go to. And then Library Mall was a big one, gathering spot to where make all the speeches and stuff, then march up State Street to the Capitol.
Harold Heidke was a news cameraman at WKOW in 1970, and he shot much of the footage you're watching. They recorded on film in those days, and that film needed to be developed before it could be aired on TV.
To make it on the 6 o'clock news, when did you have to have the film back?
Well, we'd have to have it back here by 3 o'clock.
It wasn't like videotape today. We'd get it out to the station, but then it'd take 20 minutes to process it, and we put it on the air without editing.
Ken, why do you plan to burn your personal check?
Blake Kellogg was a WKOW reporter who covered the anti-war protests in Madison from the beginning in the mid-1960s. He remembers the striking difference in the city at the time.
It was literally like a war zone on Bascom Hill, all the way up Bascom Hill, all around. I would leave there, and within a few blocks, it was the utter tranquility of Madison, Wisconsin.
Like we know today?
Yeah, like we know today. My kids were playing out in the front yard.
It was a wonderful time to be a journalist. It was a wonderful time.
Why?
Everything was so intense. There was so much news.
Patricia Sims was in her first year as a reporter at the Wisconsin State Journal in 1970. She spent much of that time covering the anti-war protests.
The protests mostly were on some sort of unpublished schedule. You know, you'd have breakfast in the morning, you'd go into work, you'd go to a protest, you'd go to a demonstration. You'd come back, write it, at night it would start again. I went through voluminous pairs of shoes because they would get tear gassed or they would get stepped on by a mob or whatever.
The mobs and tear gas were just a few of the hazards for journalists covering the news in 1970. The anti-war protests at that point almost always involved some level of violence, and members of the news media were in the line of fire.
3 of us one time, the demonstrators were coming at us, and we said, okay, we better get out of the way, and they started throwing pop bottles. Well, 2 of us got behind the tree. The guy from the radio station didn't make it, and a pop bottle hit him on top of the head, and it peeled his scalp back. So, we found out that, hey, you can't hide too many people behind one tree.
You don't want to be caught in the wrong place, either side. The cops didn't like you, the protesters didn't like you, because your pictures could get them in trouble.
Dennis Conner worked as a news photographer for the wire service United Press International, or UPI, in 1970. That was the year he ended up with a chipped tooth after apparently being in the wrong place at the wrong time covering a protest at the state capitol.
Everything seemed pretty calm. I wasn't paying a lot of attention, and all of a sudden, a cop brought a billy club into my face, and I could feel my teeth in the back of my throat.